Welcome to you all to this webinar, co-produced, one might say, by the Living Project from the Finnish Heritage Agency and the UNESCO Chair on Intangible Cultural Heritage and Sustainable Development at the CY Paris University. So great to have you all here. We have joined our forces to bring together an interesting program for you today, discussing living heritage, a resource and a source for change, and the interlinkages between living heritage and sustainable development. We have been preparing for this event throughout this autumn, one might say, and we were quite busy with that. We thought we were a bit late when we opened a registration link to this, but we were very happy to see the registration results from 33 countries I counted most recently, and 115 people registered to this event. I will first say a few words about the Living Project. So, and myself also. So Elisa Kraatari, hello. Finnish Heritage Agency and the Living Project. I've been coordinating this project since September 21 when this started. We will continue until next spring. This is run by the Finnish Heritage Agency, but it's mainly funded by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. We are also cooperating with the Northern Dimension Partnership on Culture, NDPC. Shortly, what is Living Project about? So living heritage and sustainable development really are at the core of this project. It builds mainly and most importantly on the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, the UNESCO Convention from 2003, and celebrating its anniversary this year. And of course, the Agenda 20 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Something about the goals of this project. So we started this project with the aim to learn together about the linkages between living heritage and living heritage safeguarding and practices and sustainable development and related goals. We wanted to create new networks and together enhance our capacities to understand this topic more, and also create the opportunities for new projects, even products and services that would start from this project. We are currently working on the online platform that will collect together all the results and achievements from this project. We are looking forward especially to the pilot projects we had this winter and spring, and the policy brief that is coming from our research team. So good news coming in spring 24 in this regard. In this project, we have 9 countries with 15 different partnering areas and organizations. We have already had 10 international webinars and workshops before this one. And indeed, in this project, we also funded with 75,000 euros. So there were small pilot funds that we gave to pilot projects that tested in practice how living heritage and sustainable development work together. See more on our website. And that's that for my part. I'll give it now to Chiara Bortolotto, who has been working with us in planning and preparing for this webinar.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. I am also really glad that we managed to work together for this webinar, which is the first one of the new series, I would say, of the second year of this series of webinars, which are organized by the UNESCO Chair on Intangible Cultural Heritage and Sustainable Development. And I think that really working together is adding a lot of value to this, I mean, to our respective endeavors. I hope so, at least. We will see at the end of this webinar. So I will be very brief. The UNESCO Chair on Intangible Cultural Heritage and Sustainable Development is based at CY University in Paris. The idea of this webinar is really to create a space for discussing the relationship between intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. So to see how sustainable development changes our representation of what intangible cultural heritage is. So also how it changes the social and political function of intangible cultural heritage on the one hand, and on the other hand, to see how and if intangible cultural heritage has an impact on the ways we think about sustainability and sustainable development. And I think that today we will really discuss this kind of issues. The seminar this year, we will have other sessions. I just would like to let everybody know that we will have, so the next session will be on the 18th of January and will be about intangible cultural heritage and climate change. Will be like an exploratory round table. And then the following session will be on the 4th of March, 26th of March, and 16th of April. And those webinars will be an opportunity to discover and discuss the research conducted by other UNESCO chairs on intangible cultural heritage and by colleagues that are working on intangible cultural heritage globally at the international level. So you will find the detailed program of the webinar on the web page of the UNESCO Chair. And if you would like to be part of the mailing list, so in order to receive information about the upcoming webinars and other activities of the UNESCO Chair, please drop me an email. My email address will be visible at the end of the presentation later on. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisa and Chiara. Just a quick note from me. So I am Leena Marcio, and I work as senior advisor here in the Finnish Heritage Agency, and I've been coordinating the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Heritage for almost 10 years now. So I think what all brings us today together is intangible heritage or living heritage and sustainability. And we are really people from many fields, from crafts and music and theater, nature-related heritage, oral heritage. We are researchers, students, and really a nice and diverse group from different corners of Europe and even different corners of the world. So, I mean, we have culture, we have heritage, we have intangible heritage, and sometimes one feels that, are we a bit there in the corner, and what's the meaning of it all? And I think here in the Living Project, we have really wanted to see and think in a way that intangible heritage is really in the center of development and sustainability, and where are we steering this big boat? So I warmly want to welcome you to this event as well, and I am really looking forward to our fantastic speakers and panelists today. So enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you for the welcomes, Leena, that I happily join in doing. In this part, I will now quickly share one image from my screen, and it is about how you can interact during this afternoon with us. A quick look to the program. As Chiara mentioned, it's available on the UNESCO Chair pages. It's also available on our web page. And when you have now Menti on your browser or phone or pad, you can go onto this link and get there also from here. And now I would like to ask John to take the stage, to join us here and start your part in this program. You have had your spoons in many soups before, and now even this soup. But I think it would be most wise if I give the stage to you for also the presentation, so you can say a few words about your career so far and your expertise, and go on with your presentation then.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you also, Lena, Chiara, for the opportunity to address you on this occasion. I like the metaphor of having put my spoon in many soups. I won't give you a full overview of every bowl of soup I've ever eaten, but for these purposes, it's perhaps worth noting three things. First, that I am by background and by academic training a political scientist, though I've not been in an academic position for many years. And that obviously colors the way I think about things. But I'm also someone who worked for 18 years in the social and human science sector of UNESCO. So in a very interdisciplinary background where I hope I can combine political science expertise with anthropological, philosophical, and other angles of great importance for issues relating to culture. Most recently, I've been working as a consultant for the past 2 years on two bodies of work that have many common features and indeed some institutional connections and are directly relevant to the discussion in the webinar this afternoon. The first, starting in spring 2022, was work with the coalition of NGOs mobilizing to lobby for the idea of a specific culture goal within the SDG framework, SDG 18, if you will, though actually there are many advocacy campaigns trying to claim SDG 18. So maybe we'll end up with SDGs 18 up to 27 or something in due course. But still, let's say SDG 18. The reason why this campaign exists is no doubt very familiar to many of you. It is the fact that culture really got left out in the original formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals as adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015. It's a striking absence. And this goes back to the earlier absence in the outcome document of the 2012 UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which was held in Rio de Janeiro, and where culture, despite the best efforts of many stakeholders, was basically left out of the agenda. Sustainable development was defined in terms of the interaction between three pillars, supposedly autonomous pillars that combined, though that can be criticized, the pillar of the environment, of the economy, and of society. And many people, even at the time, were saying there's something very big missing there. I would remind you, if you haven't noticed, that another structural absence from that agenda is science, which was mentioned in the outcome document of the Rio Plus 20 conference only as a so-called means of implementation, as if science was simply a tool to achieve political objectives. Not many scientists could be happy with that, just as not many practitioners in culture, whether in intangible heritage or other areas, could be happy with the structural absence of culture. The second thing I've been doing in 2023, in conjunction with UNESCO, is working on the idea of culture as a global public good, which, as you may know, was an explicit component of the outcome document of the World Conference on Cultural Policies, Mondiacult 2022, which was held in Mexico last September. It was a success in many ways to get the language of culture as a global public good, or as it's sometimes called, a common good of humanity. Some people prefer that vocabulary. I'm not sure there's a fundamental difference between the two phrases myself, on the agenda. But of course, it raises the question, what does it mean? What difference does it make? How do you follow up? And one of the possible follow-ups is indeed to ensure better integration of culture into the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, if you take that as a starting point in the context of this webinar, there are a number of different ways you could discuss it. One way would be in terms of international politics. What are the challenges, the possibilities, the limitations that make it likely or unlikely that a coalition of states could emerge to support the idea of revising the SDG framework to include culture, even either to replace the current 2030 agenda after 2030, or perhaps earlier, recognizing the limitations of achievement of the current agenda. That would be an interesting discussion, a very political science discussion. You could also have a more technical discussion. What does it mean what would it mean to frame targets and indicators for such a culture goal? What would the content have to be to make it meaningful, both for the 2030 agenda and for the range of practitioners, not just in the culture sector narrowly defined, but the range of people involved in culture, which is literally everyone. That discussion has been launched by a document produced by the NGO coalition lobbying for SDG or advocating for SDG 18. And there is a so-called zero draft available, published in that document in September 2022, which suggests some specific targets and a methodology for developing indicators, including by using the existing indicators of conventional frameworks. That technical discussion is also an interesting one for anyone with a professional interest in international or even national policy frameworks. However, I'm not sure it's the best way, either of those is the best way of discussing the issue for the present purposes, because both of those agendas have a big defect, which is that they are very top-down and technocratic. They're about high-level UN processes, which I think misses what is most valuable about the SDG framework, which is that while, of course, as the 2030 agenda says in the resolution of the UN General Assembly, it is the primary responsibility of states and thus of governments to achieve the 2030 agenda. It is and was intended to be an agenda for everyone, an agenda that can have significance at every institutional level, including even down to the individual. And while the 2030 agenda and its sustainable development goals has only been very partly achieved, there are some very big gaps and some reasons to be concerned that the political dynamic has broken down in the face of the pandemic and international conflict. There has been one big success, which is providing not just the international community, very abstract and global, but also people at all levels of society, in government, in local authorities, in NGOs, in businesses, with a shared language with which to discuss the issue of sustainability. And I find that, for the purposes of this webinar, to be a more interesting angle. Hence the title of my presentation, Whose Sustainability and Sustainability of What? Seen, of course, from the perspective of culture for this discussion, but you could ask the same questions about science in ways that would have some very interesting parallels. So you might say, but we know what is to be sustainable. It's development, right? Yeah, but what's development? And the whole point of development is that it is a word that can mean almost anything, depending on your presuppositions, on your vantage points, on your political agendas. That's why it produced consensus with the international community. But visions of development, interpretations of development are so diverse, for very good reasons, that you can't actually say that once you've defined sustainability of what in terms of development, you've actually answered the question. It still doesn't tell you what's valuable, what the disagreements might be, and how to achieve it. Particularly if you're thinking in terms of institutional practice at the level of a museum, a theater company, a dance group, an NGO advocating for cultural diversity, or any of the other profiles, many of which I imagine are represented among the audience today. So what's development? And there we just come against the same vicious circle of verbal definition. If you go back to the origins of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 1987 Brundtland report, authored by the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, the definition of development is meeting human needs in a way that ensures that future generations will be able to meet their needs. That's what makes it sustainable. But human needs are just as open to interpretation, disagreement, and uncertainty as development is. So meeting human needs doesn't actually tell you what matters and what you should be doing about it. Hence, the second part of my title, Whose Sustainability, or Sustainability for Whom? Sometimes this is framed in very environmental terms in international debate. Sustainability is sustainability of the planet. You know the language perhaps of the Stockholm Resilience Institute, preserving a safe operating space for humanity, as if within that safe operating space, questions of sustainability did not or do not arise. I think that's a mistake, and I'm not the only one. Many people have been saying this, of course. The reason why it's a mistake is that, of course, environmental sustainability matters, but even within the narrow Rio+20 Sustainable Development Agenda enacted by the General Assembly in 2015, the environment is just one pillar of sustainable development. Sustainable poverty reduction, sustainable gender equality, sustainable cities, sustainable international partnerships, and perhaps the most interesting of the Sustainable Development Goals in their current form, sustainable peace, justice, and inclusion, SDG 16, are just as important in the SDG agenda as oceans or biodiversity or the climate or energy. And justly so, because the whole point is to establish the connections. This means that the sustainability of what and the sustainability for whom questions are very closely connected. They're about imagining a subject, as one says in political philosophy, that can think about the world it lives in and the challenges it faces in terms of building a community, who, and deciding how that community is to develop over time. Develop not in the quantitative economic sense of development, but in a much richer sense that includes all aspects of human needs and human flourishing. And that, of course, is where culture comes in. How could one possibly imagine considering sustainability of human needs satisfaction without reference to culture, since we know from the social sciences and from our own daily experience, both personal and professional, that human needs are filtered through cultural understandings of what matters for human beings, why it's important to have certain things, why the needs of human beings go considerably beyond the organic needs of bodily survival to encompass a whole range of things at individual and community level that are ultimately about cultural practices, the practices of memory and storytelling, of performance, of representation, visual, sonic, and so on. And of course, the practices of community collective existence, including the political manifestation, which is what would generically be called self-government. So when you take it in those terms, I think you see first why the absence of culture matters so much. Second, why the idea of connecting culture to the Sustainable Development Goals is very closely connected to this idea of culture, not particular cultural products, but culture as such, as the common good of humanity or a global public good, and why these are not just issues for states, which might indeed not be resolved at state level because the requirements of international intergovernmental consensus are very demanding, but can be considered as issues within basically any form of social interaction. Now, going down to the level of the individual is interesting, but perhaps not the most interesting for present purposes. But thinking at the level of institutions, even small institutions that are called upon to make choices as to what to do, what priorities to adopt, how to manage their affairs, and so on, that clearly is of decisive importance in establishing such an agenda. From which I would draw in closing, since my time is up for the moment, but we'll have time to discuss all of this, I hope, as we go through the meeting, as Elisa explained, using technology to facilitate the interaction, some conclusions that I would state almost as slogans. First, when we're affirming the importance of culture, we're not just talking about the cultural and creative economy or the cultural sector. And we're certainly not just talking about the remit of culture ministries. Culture is much too important to be left to culture ministries. because we are talking about the way in which the very idea of sustainability involves cultural interpretations of human needs and the creation of cultural practices embedded in beliefs and so on that enable those human needs to be satisfied. The questions of poverty eradication or eradication of extreme poverty and reduction of poverty, realization of gender equality, universalization of education, questions about health, about sustainable production and consumption, all of these are cultural questions. There is no sustainability without a culture of sustainability. And of course, culture of sustainability implies the existence of sustainability of culture, including through the institutions that make culture sustainable in the very practical institutional sense, that it can continue over time. Not in the same forms necessarily, but at least without losing the capital created by cultural practices. Secondly, culture is too important to be left to culture ministries, and sustainable development is much too important to leave culture out, or culture is much too important to be left out of the sustainable development agenda. The world is not achieving the 2030 agenda, though it can find reasons to be proud of certain specific achievements. The agenda as a whole is not being achieved. This is in part because the agenda is in some ways incoherent. That would be a different discussion, so let me just state that as a slogan, an affirmation. But it's also because the things left out, science and culture, knowledge and values, practices, beliefs, and behaviors, are actually what should be the core. The Sustainable Development Agenda is a kind of technocratic abstraction from the reality of what matters. And finally, many in the advocacy community would disagree with me on this, but I think it's important to assert as a personal affirmation, I don't think the language of a culture pillar is the right language. What's wrong with the Sustainable Development Agenda is precisely that it is pillarized. How can you separate society and the economy? Seriously, for the purposes of thinking about sustainability. So those two pillars are already a problem. Adding another supposedly autonomous pillar, culture, and then trying to think about the relations between the four pillars as if they were relations between different things external to one another is guaranteed failure. The challenge is to connect, which means to depillarize. And I feel, though I could be wrong, and of course I don't control this agenda, I just contribute to it at my level, that introducing culture is actually a powerful lever for depillarization, which is exactly what the world needs. So as to have a culture of environmental sustainability, a culture of economic sustainability, and a culture of social sustainability. With that, in the interest of time, I will stop. I'll be happy to come back to any of those points and to fill in all the numerous gaps in my presentation in response to your questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure to listen your wisdom pouring out to us and feeding our thinking and to then think further in our own contexts and environments these issues further on. I see a couple of comments now there in the chat or in the Mentimeter relating to crafts and also, yes, to country contexts. Someone is writing, it depends on the country's context, political, legislative, social, and religious, what SDGs should be dealt with and met. And yeah, general goals such as no hunger involve a lot of effort to achieve, for sure. I think it would be good at this point, if you want to write something down on the Mentimeter, you can do that now. There's a couple of minutes. However, I think we would now smoothly go forward with the program, I think. because I think we will need every minute that we have for the panel discussion afterwards. And therefore, I would like to ask Chiara and Severin now to join us, and John hold still for a minute there while we do the change.
Thank you very much. I'll be listening carefully. I'll turn my microphone and camera off, but I'm very much here with you and listening with great interest.
Oh, thank you, John. And now do we have Chiara and Severin, your microphones on?
Yes.
And cameras. Yes, there you are, Chiara.
Okay, so Severin, are you also there?
I am.
So maybe, well, just to introduce this presentation, the title you can see is SDGs, Periodic Reporting and the Agency of Indicator. This presentation was prepared by Severin Tacha and myself. Maybe Severin, you'd like to briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chiara. Hello, everyone. So very briefly, I'm a social anthropologist. I was trained as a UNESCO facilitator in the framework of 2003 convention. I've been the director of the French Center for the Intangible Cultural Heritage for 10 years, and the Maison des Cultures du Monde, House of the World Cultures, for 4 years. It is an accredited NGO, again under the convention. And now I work as an independent consultant, and I've been collaborating during the past 3 years with various stakeholders at different levels, like UNESCO, state parties to the convention, and especially Ministry of Cultures, but also NGOs, local governments, universities, and so on. And this is why Chiara invited me to join her in this presentation. So I would like to thank Chiara for this invitation, and of course to take the opportunity to thank you all at the Finnish Heritage Agency for this initiative.
Thank you very much. Maybe before I start, very briefly, I also introduce myself because I didn't do it previously. I just introduced the UNESCO chair. So my name is Chiara Bortolotto. I am an anthropologist as well, and I hold the UNESCO chair in Intangible Cultural Heritage and Sustainable Development. Just like Severin, I was trained as a facilitator by UNESCO for the capacity building program. But mainly I am an academic, so I work on the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention from an anthropological point of view, and the social world of the convention is really my main fieldwork. And that's why I think it's very interesting to have this conversation with Severin and with a broader audience, hopefully, because I think that this is what really allows to nuance and to give some depth to my observations. So I will start, and then Severin, you can jump in whenever it's your turn. Okay, so as we have seen in the previous presentation, the Sustainable Development Goals framework is important to imagine and plan sustainable development policies. And we have also seen that if culture is to play a role in this endeavor, it has to be squeezed into this framework, because it is within this framework that sustainable development is to be imagined, managed, deployed, and performed globally. So the same kind of standardization applies to heritage, and in particular to intangible cultural heritage. We will see here how the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage is increasingly framed within standard infrastructure organized around specific results and indicators. And this certainly reflects the increasing concern for the integration of the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. In this presentation, however, we would like to open a discussion on the implications of this approach, which is often taken for granted. We argue that these frameworks are that are assumed to be neutral, technical, and universal, but in fact are performative, political, and cultural. So for many of the agents engaging with the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, the diversity of intangible cultural heritage is precisely what makes of it a creative resource for our futures, and that will allow us to adapt to difficult and different context and situation, and to adopt more sustainable ways of interacting with the natural environment, of strengthening social bonds, and taking care of the most fragile people in our society. In particular, intangible cultural heritage offers inspiring examples of environmental knowledge and ecological wisdom developed by groups that are far from the hegemonic models of Western modernity, in particular, indigenous people. So you see in these photos some examples taken from the elements inscribed on the UNESCO list, examples of alternative ways to deal with water management, for instance. So you have techniques for facing and managing risk and emergencies, or examples of alternative views on illness, healing, and healthcare. And intangible cultural heritage is here regarded as an opportunity for promoting alternative models of development based on diversity. At the same time, however, UNESCO relies on technologies of standardization, assumed to ensure effectiveness, reliability, and objectivity. These technologies are procedures that order the social world into an established framework defined by a set of recognized criteria. In this process, cultural diversity is framed into formats and procedures that provide a common syntax through organizing and arranging diversity. So it is precisely this process that makes this diversity a resource with a potential beyond the circumscribed one that these practices originally had. But this same process, however, and paradoxically, channels diversity into structure that shape it according to standard principles and criteria. So this generates a tension between, on the one hand, the need to valorize and exploit different moral understanding of sustainability, and on the other one, the need to set standards to achieve and manage sustainable development globally. So on the one hand, these standards seem necessary to attain change on the global level, but on the other, since these standards build on a given set of values and ideas, the reliance on these standards does not challenge assumptions, but aims at making the system deliver. So this can have the consequence of losing the potential and the power of diversity. So standardized representation of sustainability eventually bear the risk of sidelining the potential of particular situated and alternative understanding of ways of living in society and interacting with the natural environment, especially when these models are unsettling or unexpected. So, Séverine, I think it's you now. Would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. So the audit mechanisms that have been established to assess the performance of the state parties in implementing the convention at the national level embody this tension in practice, because they underpin the framing for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage with the 2030 agenda, and thus the order diversity into a set of indicators and benchmarks. Maybe a few words on the overall results framework and the periodic reports for those who may not be familiar with them. So the overall results framework was created in 2018. It was approved then by the General Assembly, following the recommendations of the UNESCO Internal Evaluation Service, the IWES, which in 2013 requested to, I quote, enhance cooperation with sustainable development experts for integrating ICH into non-cultural legislation and policy, and for other work related to ICH and sustainable development. And it requested also, again, I quote, to strengthen monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the convention at the national level. So until then, the periodic reports submitted by the state parties focused on the activities undertaken rather than on the results achieved. So in order to measure the results to be achieved, the evaluation service, the IOS, encouraged them to develop an overall results framework, the ORF, I quote, with objectives, timeframes, quantitative and qualitative indicators, and benchmarks. The IOS also highlighted that a set of indicators should demonstrate how culture contributes to development. And it suggested to base this monitoring process on the theory of change and the result-based management system, an approach that has been widely adopted, including at the United Nations. Next slide, please. So the overall results framework covers 8 thematic areas, which are the following: institutional and human capacities, transmission and education, inventorying and research, policies, as well as legal and administrative measures, the role of ICH and safeguarding in society, awareness raising, engagement of communities, groups, and individuals, as well as other stakeholders, and international engagement. These 8 thematic areas are declined into a set of 26 indicators and 86 assessment factors in order to measure, intended to measure the effectiveness of implementing the convention. Then each of the 28 core indicators and related assessment factors are linked with specific Sustainable Development Goals targets. For instance, the relation between SDG indicator 21, extent to which engagement for safeguarding ICH is enhanced among stakeholders, is presented as follows. I quote, the present indicator, by advocating wide participation in ICH safeguarding by a broad range of actors, supports SDG target 16.6, which is ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels, as well as SDG target 17.17, encourage and promote effective public-private, and civil society partnerships, etc. So in turn, the overall results framework has inspired the revision of the periodic report that state parties must submit to UNESCO. It is one of their very few obligations on a 6-year basis, actually. Since 2021, the new periodic report has been submitted only by states from Latin America and the Caribbean region, Europe, and the Arab regions. Next slide, please. Sorry. Now, as a member of the facilitators network for the Global Capacity Building Program, I was trained by UNESCO, and namely by Ariette Deacon and Jorin Nerik, who is with us, at the beginning of 2021 to assist the living heritage entity at UNESCO, supporting the national focal points from the Europe region who were in charge of elaborating the periodic reports through a series of online workshops. Then the feedback from the national focal points highlighted the high technical, even technocratic nature of this process. And as a former UNESCO official observed, this new periodic report system challenged even the most organized administrations new for complying with the requirements of the convention. I quote, even good students, as the Swiss were surpassed. An NFP, National Focal Point, also highlighted the difficulty of this participatory process, as most actors in the field had many other important issues to address and did not see why they should respond to this request from the state, such as the eco museums supposed to be privileged contributors to consultations. So not only did this constitute an additional burden on the shoulders of the focal points in the context of shortage of human resources, and particularly in ICH domain, but one of them explained that in his point of view, while the interrelation between ICH and sustainable development is to be appreciated in terms of resonance, namely a loose interrelation, allowing to associate the two concepts. On the contrary, the obsession with indicators, he said, leads nowhere. And I quote again, the technicization of sustainable development would make it lose its potential, as scientifying and mathemizing sustainable development is a pretended objectivity that is anything but objective. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in this perspective, the overall results framework and periodic reporting are regarded as the paroxysm of, I quote again, the same focal point, the paroxysm of an accounting approach to the cultural field, which would eventually discredit the convention, diverting the focus from intervention in the safeguarding of the ICH to scratch paper. So this meta dimension of policy turning into paperwork is in fact perceived by some of the stakeholders in charge of implementing the convention as draining resources from other and maybe more concrete forms of safeguarding interventions. As a facilitator colleague acknowledged, the periodic report is a big schmierblick. I don't know if it makes sense in English, but I hope it is understandable. We put all energies in the procedures. And the interesting fact is this bureaucratization triggers skepticism even within UNESCO, where different working cultures and sensibilities coexist that are more, let's say, humanistic and administrative. But it also triggers a concern for the loss of the potential of ICH in terms of diversity. We come with this language of indicators and we are losing all the other approaches, I quote. And yes, I would like to mention that this infography was realized by Anita Vaivod, who is with us as well. to I think in a very didactic way, show the interrelation between all the different thematic areas of the periodic report and overall results framework and the indicators. In this specific case, I liked also to illustrate what I was referring to, the idea of the cycle, because it's all very consistent, but within a given system, which is somehow closed on itself. So in other words, this perspective raised concerns on a shortcoming of the auditing process aligning the 2003 convention with the 2030 agenda. And as it has been mentioned, it is the assumption that sustainable development is an objective process and therefore accessible with a set of indicators, standard benchmarks and objectives presented as neutral, not to say universal. I will let you continue, Chiara, with the next slide.
Yes. So at the same time, however, this very technicization and bureaucratization is regarded as a strategic move by other actors of the convention, including some intangible cultural heritage experts and many of the NGOs accredited to the convention. In other words, audit mechanisms that can render sustainability technical and measurable through indicators would be an opportunity to drive change. These mechanisms enable, in fact, those who master the assessment techniques, such as NGOs and facilitators trained by the UNESCO Secretariat, like ourselves in the end, and organized in national focal points. So they would be able to channel policy making toward objectives consistent with what they regard as good governance. So periodic reporting are here considered an opportunity for introducing complexity in the governance of the convention, directing the action of the states towards sustainable development related policy goals, while diverting it from listings, basically. Indeed, initial observation of the periodic reporting processes suggests that planning intangible cultural heritage safeguarding projects, bearing in mind the need to report based on particular assessment factor, inevitably directs action to the domains considered relevant in this framework. And so here I refer to the Living Project and to interviews with Lena and Elisa. And so please, both of you, you are very welcome to jump in if you want to say something or nuance what I'm presenting. So one example of this way of using periodic reporting as an opportunity is the Living Project. So when I discussed the meaning of periodic reporting with Lena, she told me that working with periodic reporting lighted, I quote, a lamp in her head that allowed her to see things much more clearly. So periodic reporting allowed her to see what she defined a bigger connection that she explained as an understanding of safeguarding, which would be not only about keeping the old techniques in our communities, but to connect to Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. So the Living Project is one example of this. It is intended as strengthening the role of intangible cultural heritage in local communities as the source of sustainable development, well-being, and livelihoods. I think this is a quote from the webpage of the Living Project. So many of the pilot projects that you probably know very well, funded by LIVIT, are the result of this educative approach of periodic reporting. From this angle, rather than limiting the imaginary of sustainable development to a set of predefined categories, bureaucratic infrastructures are not reducing, but opening up the perspective. So they have an idealistic ambition and agency. So this is an example of how performance indicators have performative power because they can determine which issues are considered relevant and which not. In this case, listing would be less relevant. Séverine, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, what Chiara just explained becomes clear when local policy approaches to the safeguarding of the ICH do not, let's say, naturally fit with the ways of integrating ICH and sustainable development as suggested by UNESCO standards. So I'd like here to share some thoughts based on 3 past experiences in the Arab and African regions as a kind of reflective approach on my own practice. And I think this will somehow echo John's presentation. So in the first case, it was advised for the elaboration of the periodic report. I will not detail, but the fact of using a European consultant, beyond the fact that this again involves resources unrelated to its origin of the consultant. But it is not entirely totally insignificant. So of course, there was an objective reason for this, which was that I had gone through the process of supporting the national focal points of Europe in this task. And therefore, I was fully equipped for this. But this also raises the question of the benefit for the focal points and the national stakeholders, despite a very brief, let's say, training for the team dedicated to the periodic reports. The second example is that of a cultural index for the Arab and Islamic world, which is currently under development and promoted by IPESCO, and in which I must say I had no role since it was only a few rereadings of some French translations. But despite the adaptation of various international tools compiled, including the periodic reporting, the indicators retained did not always seem likely to take into account and therefore to reflect the diversity and the vitality of the local and the regional cultural practices. I'm thinking, for example, of criteria such as the number of cultural facilities or the frequency of amateur cultural practices, but in a structured framework. In the first case, I was a member of an international team mandated to design an ICH strategy. And by relying on the desire of the concerned stakeholders to, let's say, take part in the ICH movement at national and international level, the periodic reporting appeared as a kind of, not to say alternative, but complementary path to nominations. So the recommendations were therefore to base the evaluation of the strategic objectives of this strategy, this ICH strategy, on the periodic report's assessment factors, and also to design any new project with a reporting perspective. In this way, it would be easy to fill in the right boxes of the periodic reports when the time comes. I would like to add at this point that there was a lot of knowledge regarding the scarcity, the natural resource management, like water, natural air conditioning systems, etc., and which constitutes so many resources in the face of the challenges to be met current and in the future in terms of climate change. However, these elements are, for some reasons, are often not considered in this specific case as falling under ICH. So the periodic report is quite useful in this sense to raise awareness and promote these elements. So, indeed, the periodic report appears on the one hand as a tool on which Western consultants rely to convince of the good definition of ICH, but also undoubtedly allowing the various national actors to advocate for a better understanding and implementation of the convention. Ultimately, the need to comply and align with these indicators actually triggers the need to initiate and implement the processes that these indicators are intended to measure and evaluate. From this perspective, the indicator can even somehow create the phenomenon it measures. In other words, by responding to the need to measure results, indicators guide action. I will give back the floor to Chiara.
Yes, so just to conclude, periodic reporting creates a script for imagining the entanglement of intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. This can limit the imaginary of sustainability and reduce it to specific objectives compatible with the standard framework, rather than creatively expand the possibility of intangible cultural heritage to promote diverse and unconventional approaches to exploit intangible cultural heritage for imagining alternative way of considering social welfare, the relationship with the environment, or the use of natural resources. This can eventually sideline local concept of sustainability. Periodic reporting black box sustainability, namely they define it based on objective criteria that are unquestioned and taken for granted as universal, but that are in fact cultural and political. In this perspective, periodic reporting would ultimately create an inherently ethnocentric understanding of global issues and perpetuate rather than transform the status quo. At the same time, however, aware of the condition entailed by the fact of working within an institutional framework and on the fact that this process pragmatically complies with its political framework rather than resisting it, many norm entrepreneurs within the convention, including civil society organizations, regard this black boxing as an opportunity to shift state policies' focus from a quest of international visibility and prestige granted by listing to a more concrete concern for sustainability. In this sense, they exploit the highly political dimension of the audit enterprise, which is usually conceived as purely technical. So these agents of the convention consciously take on what it has been by some colleagues called the art of doing politics while pretending not to. So I hope that our aim was to give a nuanced vision of the role on the implication of using periodic reporting in order to make the connection between intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. And we wanted really to avoid value judgment. So we try not to say that this is good or bad, but just to show the complexity of the implications of this tool. So thank you very much. These were our conclusion. You can, yes, if you want to reach us, these are our emails. And I think I can stop the screen sharing.
Yes, thank you so much, Chiara and Severin, for this presentation. I will say just shortly a couple of things. When we were preparing this, we were really talking a lot what kind of presentations we would like to have. And I'm currently very happy that we had John's perspective from the big picture thinking and discussion about what is sustainability and who's sustainability and how can we achieve it in any way. And your presentation, on the other hand, takes it to a position, and that position is now the UNESCO 2003 convention. And thank you for the way you have discussed it and the complexity of it all. And what we see here basically then maybe the dynamics between your presentation and John's presentation is the dynamics between different kind of complexities that we are surrounded with. But with these words, I will leave it to it. And now I will invite our special commentators, Jerain and Katriina, on the board.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, and welcome, Jerain.
Hello.
Hello, Katriina. So maybe first to you, Jerain. I'll give the microphone to you. How did you find the presentations? What would be your short comments?
Thank you very much. And it was very fascinating being myself involved since many years in both exercises, let's call it. I'm just very happy, actually, that we have this kind of platforms today. And while you were talking, both John and then afterwards Chiara and Severin, I was thinking that actually when the whole reflection on setting the SDG agenda was happening, I often had the feeling, where are we? But I do think it is because the pillar of ICH, which most of us here gathered today, are being linked to, we are working in this sector, or how do you call it, the field of intangible cultural heritage. Actually, we were not ready for it at that moment to join the bigger exercise on the Agenda 2030. And I think already this explains how complicated this way of thinking about these issues is, because today we are here together. We have started to organize ourselves to try to reflect on these issues, which makes it maybe possible to try to join also the reflections where all these fields come together. Although even in the Mondial Cult, I think there were not so many voices from the living heritage field yet. So even then, this shows the whole complexity of, you need on the one hand, in our complex contemporary world, you need this kind of approaches to organize yourselves, to get into sectors, to get into policies. You need a lot of budgets, administration, and so on, to get things stronger. And this touches also on how things get organized and institutionalized, and then you get also power imbalances. And this is on many levels and in many scales the case. And at the same time, actually, certainly learning from the field where we are active, you see that this is not a way forward, and that is what John has been tackling. Actually, we need to learn from these whole holistic approaches for which we also cherish so much the living heritage we are all working on. So there's a lot in my mind, and I don't have like a very systematic comment now, but I have some loose points that came through my mind when listening to both of your contributions, and I will share them, and then later on in the panel we can elaborate on it. One of the things that I was thinking is that actually I have been studying on philosophy in the first part of my studies, and this whole, you could say, line of, on the one hand, the analytic, and on the other hand, the more holistic and synthetic ways of approaching things comes back here in this almost existential human exercise of how can we bring together the course of specialization and analyzing things, with also seeing that actually we need to approach it as a whole. And it already starts in our minds. As we all know, it's like, how can we bring together the two parts of our minds, the one that is mimetic and where also ICH and repeating traditions, rituals, which we need, comes together with analyzing things. As an NGO, and I'm one of the voices in Chiara's research, myself, I have chosen to use it indeed as an instrument in the theory of change, and not to see this as something neutral. I don't think actually any of us could still say that things are neutral, neither UNESCO, because what we do is choose a direction together, try to be reflexive about it, and then agree, okay, this is the direction of change we want to go towards, and we are producing instruments that bring us to move into that direction. What has happened actually is that at the start, for example, of reflecting on the overall results framework, this theory of change was very present, also in the discussions and so on, but it disappeared from the debates and the discussions at some point, which is not very honest, you could say, because actually this shows what we are doing. We are trying to make an agenda of change, and it's better to agree about it and to make it very clear so that you can move together towards that point, which is not at all neutral. No, it's like an organized change, which we have agreed to go that direction as humanity, you could say. And when I go and talk to young people, I always explain UNESCO not as being something very international or neutral, but as something very normative, which happens to have started, and it's very actual at this moment, to have started after the World Wars in the 20th century, which we call the World Wars, but which actually was a very European war. Of course, the whole world was involved due to colonialism. And this makes clear how, on the one hand, this whole institutional context where we are starting from still is dealing with a lot of complexity of history. We are trying to get in another context today, and for which the solutions we have developed in the past are maybe not the best solutions. So it's very interesting to listen to John and hear that we need to get away from the pillars. I think we are still organizing our societies or international organizations and so on in pillars, while we have been seeing for a few decades that this is not the way to go. But then how to organize a holistic approach? How could we do it? And in that sense, I go back to the convention we are working on the living heritage. It's interesting that there has been integrated at some point this idea that we do not only need to look at education and at training and so on in formalized ways, but actually we should try to learn from which kind of transmission and education systems that are embedded within the practices and the traditions and the heritage communities we're working with, to learn from these, because actually these have been evolving and transforming over time. So what can we learn actually from the very living heritage that we are working with? And maybe there are, again, in the way that Chiara was explaining, we can learn from the diversity of approaches that are not so very much in either the holistic, either the pillarized sense, but in a whole series of approaches of transforming our practices. Maybe we can also learn from it and try to apply it to the exercise that we are currently making.
Jerain, maybe we will in this moment hear a word also from Katriina. Actually, as you just mentioned, transformation or this transition in sustainability. And Katriina, you have been working on that a lot. And now that you have heard from, on the one hand, the very holistic view from John, and then this more positioned practice-related view from Chiara and Séverine in the frame of the ICH Convention. What are your first, not feelings, but thoughts about these presentations and this discussion?
Yes, so thank you first to be invited to this webinar and later the panel also, and for very interesting presentations, and also Joran's speech here commenting these two presentations. Maybe I introduce me in a way that my background is in European ethnology. So I've done both my master's and doctor's thesis, doctor's level degrees in European ethnology. Currently, I am working and I have been working quite a long time already in the future studies. So I am combining futures research and currently cultural heritage research. So I am an adjunct professor in cultural heritage studies, and I am also involved in the sustainability research. So and I have this kind of expert positions in both in and have had both in ICH and sustainable development. And my perspective always here starts from my roots from European ethnology. So my perspective is the perspective of individual human beings. So in plural, so to say, human beings together and their shared cultural issues between human beings. And my perspective is also, so I'm looking critically both heritage policy and sustainability policy from the perspective of individual human beings. What I really value in these presentations today is that I could find actually this same perspective in all of these speeches. So how human beings are involved in these processes and how, so to say, culture could flow freely and find different diverse forms and these kind of issues. And I think this is maybe the most important issue in implementation of maybe both sustainable development and different heritage conventions, and especially intangible cultural heritage, because intangible cultural heritage is, as you all mentioned already, knowledge, different forms of knowledge and values and practices and these kind of issues which in living form are only in living human beings. So you cannot, if you put them in archive and museum, they are still pictures, but not in the same way living anymore. So we are dealing with human beings who are active in the world. But then I'm also looking this from the perspective of nature. For me, the important values are not only how to find well-being for and good living for human beings, but for other living beings, the whole universe, say nature as a whole, and how different cultural issues like intangible cultural heritage or sustainable development goals, what kind of impact they have both to really on grassroots level to human beings and nature and the future of both of these. And it's really interesting to see then in detail these analyses how there is these kind of contradictory issues like what Chiara and Severin analyzed there, how these systems of periodic reports and indicators and all of this standardized this kind of free cultural processes. I think this kind of tension is somehow baked in the basics of this kind of conventions, because they are legal regulated issues on international, national, and local, and so forth levels, and they connect individual human beings and their ideas, how they are living in the world. So there is always some kind of tension, and then to try to find this kind of forms of implementation where this tension could be as small as possible is then the question. And I think the aim of these speeches today was this. But I would add nature more strongly there in a way that actually, when I listened to your presentations, for me, they sounded as forms of, so to say, weak sustainability, which means that all of these, if we still would like to talk in form of pillars, economic, social, environmental, and cultural are equal. But actually, when this Brundtland report, for instance, was mentioned, so the basic of this sustainable development as an idea is to avoid environmental problems. So that's the nature is the basic, and I really rely on the knowledge of natural scientists also, and their knowledge about biodiversity loss and climate change and pollution and these kind of issues, which have really a value for me also, and I think for most of people, and to somehow more strongly take for instance, in Mondial Cult, like declarations and implementation of intangible cultural heritage, this the importance of these planetary boundaries and nature included in this, as well as then actually I do not very much like SDGs as this kind of implementation form of sustainable development. This is the tool which we have, and there is lots of criticism in this in the sustainability science too. But this there, as mentioned, there is not culture is not included, and I also think that it should be there more strongly, and not actually not as a pillar. I would not like to have any pillars at all, but transformation processes, and also then this kind of cultural sustainability transformation, where our cultural habits, practices, values, and knowledge will change, transform to be more sustainable than limit inside of planetary boundaries. So I would like to see both of these systems to change a little bit and to meet more each other.
Thank you, Katriina. And now what we all are going to see here is the smooth movement towards the panel section of this webinar. And basically, I'm throwing the ball back to Jorain, who is going to act as the moderator for the panel discussion. Maybe at this point, I shortly again would share the screen quickly. So we are only taking questions and comments in through this method to be ergonomic with the time use. But without any more advice, the link and the number are in the chat window of this Zoom, so you can find them also there. But please, Jorain, take the lead.
Okay, I'd be happy to. Maybe let's start with a very basic question immediately to John. Are you there, John? We cannot yet see you.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I switched off, so I was not supposed to be able to walk around.
Okay, but
I'm absolutely here, and I've been listening with great interest.
Maybe let's start with a question, as you're quite pronounced on the pillar approach. If no pillar, then how would you propose to proceed? Maybe let's have a look at that question first.
Well, first of all, let me make it clear, I'm not hostile to a culture pillar, I'm hostile to pillars. And let me just take two examples, which I think are very connected to things said previously, including by Katriina. Are greenhouse gas emissions an environmental, a social, or an economic issue? Answer obviously is all three. That's the whole point. Let me take perhaps another different example. Is work a social issue or an economic issue? The answer, of course, is both inseparably. That's the whole point. So breaking down the pillars is the challenge. And there is a risk that a neat, tidy culture pillar, if it was adopted, could actually entrench pillarization in ways that I think are very negative. negative for how environmental issues relate to social and economic issues, and negative, of course, in terms of how social and economic issues relate to one another. And work is just the summary for all of those problems. So the dilemma, the potential dilemma is, should one push pragmatically for a culture pillar, recognizing that pillarization is not a good thing in itself? Or should one explicitly try to use culture as leverage for depillarization? And that's a tactical, strategic judgment. I have my personal view, but of course others might disagree because it depends what's going to work. My personal view is that that issue should be avoided. It's not helpful. What should be pushed for is a culture goal. And if the international community at the institutional level doesn't want that culture goal to be formally incorporated into the SDGs before 2030, then let those who care start incorporating it immediately. Because the strength of the SDG framework is that it's not just about states. Of course, states are important. They have the primary responsibility. They are the signatories to the conventions. The monitoring processes concern states as kind of first line respondents to the challenges. But if states don't want it, others can still do it. This is what I would call the shadow goal approach. Let's do it. Let's adopt, among those who wish, a culture goal as a shadow framework to move towards change that will take time. And let's avoid talking about pillars because they don't help. That would be my personal view.
Chiara or Séverine, do you want to comment on these first reflections?
It's not directly on this first reflection, but if you allow me, Jorien, I would like to take the opportunity to react on your first round of reactions regarding the question of, you said, of course, it is not neutral, and of course, all those systems are the heritage of the history of these institutions. And of course, we are all aware of this. But I think it's not but. So I think we face here exactly the same problem that we have with the underrepresentation of the accredited NGOs from some regions, or the underrepresentation of accredited NGOs from the European regions, also with the elements listed. And we could take many other examples just to say that, of course, these tools, mechanisms, politics, and so on, of course, we have all agreed on them at the global level with all the representatives of the state parties. But on the other hand, let's say that they are more designed by and for some certain stakeholders and regions of the world and for the others. And then it's like we could have the same reflection, for example, within the European Union. But just to say that then we are like surprised because not everybody takes part in these processes, and we run after participation and corrective politics to have everybody on board. So just to say that the periodic reporting is a challenging process for everyone, including the European countries and the most let's say organized administrations. But the challenges they are facing and mentioning, the national focal points, it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly at the same level. And yeah, so I think we we somehow reproduce some kind of some patterns, let's say, and we really have to be aware of this. So sorry, I did not. It was another thought, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to raise this point.
Well, it is quite linked, I think, because it is how can we learn from what is happening, whether it's pillarization or repeating the same patterns of power and institutional disbalances that are there. How can we, there will be past 50 years again since the SDG framework was set. How can we learn from our experience now to set a new approach which we can integrate those lessons, and there it is very, very interesting to see that instead of, for example, in a framework like the overall results framework for the 2003 convention, it's even strengthening some of these. So now it's the time to reflect on these and to see how it could be done differently. Chiara, do you have any reflection in this regard?
Yes, well, I agree with what you all said. I think that the point is just to be aware of the fact that when we act on when we intervene, we are using certain categories and concept that and we should not take them for granted. Whether we translate them into indicators or a target or a benchmark or whatever, they actually have an impact and they shape the policy that will be implemented later on. And so, yes, my point basically is just to be always alert on that. And I think that's also the role of academics and of people or also of actors as we are that are engaging with the convention, but at a certain point they step back and they reflect on what they're doing, just always to be aware of the impact that we are having and not taking it for granted and say, okay, so these are the criteria that we have agreed on and then we just go ahead. But maybe what is interesting in this kind of occasion are really important with that in that regard is to go back on those criteria and just acknowledge that they have implications in practice.
I heard two more things in your reflections. One is the one of Katrina about should there not be more weight to the ecological dimension? And there's another one maybe to address, and this is actually we need to facilitate connections, but then how can you facilitate connections? It's like a meta question. How can you organize this kind of intersectional approach, connecting approach, mediate these kind of things? Maybe let's start with the connecting, and then afterwards we come back to the how can you, in the balance of what is maybe more prioritized or urgent, we can work on that. John, do you want to comment on the connecting issue?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important issue, and of course you can do connections. You can do it at a high theoretical level by emphasizing the importance of connections. And of course, I've often done that in my career because I have a taste for the theoretical. But useful though that can be, I don't think it's the most important. I think the most important is to show, not tell, to quote Wittgenstein. In other words, show at a very practical level the connections between things that don't obviously appear connected. And this isn't necessarily very difficult. For instance, what are the cultural dimensions of fisheries management? Well, the answer is there are lots, and they're very rich and situational and complex. And they point to ways of managing fisheries, including in areas of ecological sensitivity with declining fish stocks, overfishing, and so on, that fully include fishing communities, not just as people who happen to fish, and who have a stake in fish stocks, but as people who have a culturally determined relation to the ocean and to the practices of fishing. And we know from experience, this is documented in many studies, that this actually works better. It's a win-win situation. It engages communities in what matters to them and therefore ensures their involvement, and at the same time leads to better fish stock management. And I think there are many examples of how the disconnects due to the siloization of public policies, to the fact that institutions tend to specialize in particular, sometimes rather narrow agendas, is losing something of value that can actually be exemplified quite simply. And again, I referred to the question in speaking earlier, what is it to have a cultural framework that facilitates the achievement of universal primary education for all? That's an education policy challenge, but it's also a cultural challenge. The question of girls' education, which obviously is one of the biggest gaps in the achievement of SDG 4 so far, is a question that cannot be regarded simply as an educational issue. It's a fundamentally cultural and social issue as well, and it needs to be addressed in context. Of course, reporting on failure can be valuable because it points to failure and perhaps generates energy. But working to achieve even modest success by actually making the connections in particular situations, in response to particular forms of the issues, is, I think, more valuable. And that usually comes at the grassroots level through a combination of urgency and personal connections. Something appears urgent to a community, and the people involved in the different dimensions of the urgency are able to talk to one another. Let's celebrate that and try to build on it, not to scale up, which is often the wrong approach because community level approaches don't always scale up, but to replicate, transfer, adapt, disseminate rather than scale up. Sorry, that was a lot of words, but I hope you got the point of what I was trying to say.
Yeah, learning to see it is one thing, and then how to empower these kind of things that we can learn from is I think the exercise we all need to do for the next years.
Absolutely.
If I can just react to what John said, I think that in this perspective, I mean, this is where periodic reporting or this kind of structure can also play an important role, because in order to make connections, you need to have common denominators and a shared language and a shared vocabulary. And so this is where those standardizing tool can actually play a role. And I think that Séverine had something to say with that regard, especially with regards to intersectoriality, because that's what was her experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chiara. I would just like to refer to an informal conversation that I had with a member of the Living Heritage Entity team about the periodic reporting process that at least within the Europe region, within the states of the Europe region, concretely allowed for more transversality, I mean concrete work, at least at the state level. We all know how difficult, how challenging it is to have this transversality. We know that ICH is not only about culture, but about education, health, tourism, education, and so on. But when it comes to concretely work together for some very understandable administrative reasons, not to say political reasons, it's really challenging. But it appears that in at least many cases, the process of the periodic report really facilitated this in a concrete way. And then maybe not everybody, but many stakeholders at the state level understood why ICH is not only about culture, and why it was important to have on board representatives of the many different ministries, direction, tangible heritage, intangible heritage, and so on. So this is, I think, one of the most important and positive impacts of this process of the periodic reporting.
Does this mean that if you organize transversality or intersectoriality actually here is also an approach? It would mean that we could also organize like spaces where things come together, where things connect.
I think that's a very good point. I referred myself to this idea of a shared language, which both Chiara and Séverine and yourself, Joreen, have mentioned. And I think it's one of the important successes of the SDG framework to have offered a shared language which facilitates communication among stakeholders occupying very different positions, geographical, scale, level of responsibility, thematic, and so on. On the other hand, there is also always the risk, again, I'm quoting Wittgenstein, but why not? Let's go for Wittgenstein, that the limits of my language become the limits of my world. In other words, the shared language becomes limiting if it's not constantly challenged, but not challenged to the extent that it ceases to be shared. So there's a delicate balancing act there. And I agree with what Chiara and Séverine said, that the monitoring processes, when they work well and when they're genuinely multi-stakeholder in character, can provide that space where the language is both recognized and interrogated at the same time, so that it doesn't become simply static, rigid, and purely bureaucratic, which it can, unfortunately. Some monitoring processes in other kinds of conventions and policy frameworks can have that character. So there's this constant to and fro between measuring things we agree are important and asking whether what we're measuring is really what we should be measuring. And if you can keep that balance, then yes, you can make the kind of positive progress that has been made in certain areas in which Séverine was just referring to.
I would add that language is one, in my opinion, one of the main issues when it comes to this periodic reporting, because it is not only the periodic reports have to be submitted by the states either in French or in English, and not only is it challenging in view of the participating approach. So many states had developed alternative, lighter, translated questionnaires for their national, regional stakeholders, but it is also challenging for many national focal points themselves when it comes to elaborating the reports. And I think it is really part of all that system I referred to, and let's say the not only the inequalities but standardization process through the language. I have no solution, actually.
One of the things that we didn't touch upon, but which I experienced myself, is it's not only between sectors that it's sometimes difficult to grasp where things happen, but also across boundaries, because the states parties approach is, of course, also one that makes us focus very much on national and multinational processes, but there's also a lot of transnational processes happening and which escape the framework right now. So let's have a look at how can we also prioritize or have some balance in which dimensions or pillars or whatever you call it can maybe at some point be more or less considered important. Katrina, do you want to elaborate before we exchange on it?
Actually, if I think the roots of this ecological perspective, so then this nature ecological conditions on our globe must be prioritized, and then these so planetary boundaries, and we have then science there, and in this case natural sciences, who can tell what's happening there and how human beings are, what is the impact of human beings, and where there is some problems. It is of course this kind of process which is dynamic. We will have all the time new information, and so to say, this also the way to touch this must be dynamic. But actually, I think that the most important thing how to deal with these kind of problems is, as John also mentioned, to involve people and to have these kind of processes where human beings together can co-create solutions. And when I'm working in future studies, so for me this methodology is a combination of future studies and heritage studies and sustainability studies, and to use participatory workshops, for instance, where people can think about these issues together, and to imagine futures where we, for instance, have say climate change is now plus 3 grades from current situation, or in what kind of world are we living then, what kind of intangible heritage could we have there. And by this kind of imagination, learn to see that futures are always different than current states. And what we do today is we will make the futures today. So what kind of intangible heritage, for instance, should we have today in order to co-create this kind of world where we would like to live? If we would have this kind of participatory processes, so we have done this kind of pilot issues in Finland together with museums. So if, for instance, museums could have this kind of working form for people to imagine different futures, and how intangible heritage could help to reach this kind of desirable futures. This could be one way to do this. And I think it is in the spirit of this kind of conventions of ICH and the process of transformation towards a more sustainable world.
Does any of the colleagues want to connect to that?
Yeah, I think you framed the problem in a very interesting way, Katrina. My view on this, and I've been writing a lot about this in the past few years, both while I was still at UNESCO and since I've left UNESCO, is that this is probably the most important political issue of today. At the conceptual level, there are many other issues that are practically important, but conceptually, international policy discourse is still working within the idea of planetary boundaries, safe operating conditions for humankind, solving the climate crisis. In other words, defining everything that is non-human as a set of boundary conditions or constraints on the satisfaction of human needs. And we know that this is what created the problem, seeing nature as external, something from which value is extracted by humans for human purposes, but we have to be careful not to go too far, not to extract too much. But the solution is being framed, or the supposed solution, is largely being framed in the same terms. And I think that's the fundamental problem. In fact, what we should be doing, which is very obvious when you think about it, is recognizing that natural processes, trees, oceans, fish, carbon dioxide molecules, mountains, and all the rest, are not external to human needs and human flourishing, but part of a world that is shared by humans, making sense of it in a certain way, and by others who may or may not be making sense of it. But again, Wittgenstein, if lions could talk, we wouldn't understand them. So we're not sure exactly what sense others make of it, but we can't simply deny their agency and can't simply assume that it only matters to us, as if we were still stuck within a stewardship mentality. But it's very hard to get beyond the stewardship mentality because the whole environmental movement is based on it. If you go back to the history of the environmental movement emerging in the late 19th century, it was all about stewardship. And clearly stewardship is better than destruction. But it locks you into the idea that you're managing something external to yourself, instead of thinking about how you connect organically to a planet that is a fully integrated system of which humans are part, and a very important part. We're entitled to care about ourselves, just not to feel that the other stuff is external to us. I see this as a very exciting challenge, but it comes up against the brick wall of established institutions, which are defined in completely the opposite way. As we will see in Dubai in a few days, when UNFCCC COP will again fail to live up to the ambitions of those who dream of a strong, coordinated, and effective international climate action. To borrow a phrase, I don't know if you know the film, We're Wearing the Wrong Trousers. Do you know the film, the Wallace and Gromit animated film, The Wrong Trousers, perhaps? If you haven't seen it, it's really good. Watch it. But the reason I refer to it is that Steve Rayner, the late Steve Rayner, an important philosopher, sociologist of science, who wrote extensively about these issues, used the phrase the wrong trousers to analyze the process by which the Kyoto Protocol failed. Because in his view, which I think is well supported by the evidence, the Kyoto Protocol was modeled on the Montreal Protocol, banning CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, to protect the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol was, generally speaking, a success. The Kyoto Protocol was a disastrous failure. It was a failure because it took the same model as the Montreal Protocol, but to address something radically different. We're still wearing the wrong trousers.
Well, and I think our time is up, and I think we are on a point where we need to follow up in another webinar, because mediating this kind of connecting and boundary work and is still an exercise for a long time. So, but I hand over to Elisa and Lena again.
Thank you so much. What a conclusion to it all. We are still wearing the wrong trousers. I really like that. I'm sure that is, at least remember that, if not anything else. Thank you for the presentations and the panel discussions. There wasn't so much activity on the Mentimeter. I suppose people have been very interested in just listening and oozing it in one way or the other. There is one thing that I point out from the Menti comments. It's pertains, I think, to what was discussed earlier about the participatory processes. And there is one question probably for the peers and colleagues. How could we, as living heritage admins and experts, better connect with situational cultural aspects of various sectors, services, or industries? And probably especially when they are related to nature or nature-based resources and productions. But I will not answer it, and I'm not looking for your answers anymore, as we are already 2 minutes past the hour here. But over to Lena, what would you like to say as a conclusion?
Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for this fascinating and inspiring and thought-provoking discussion. I'm really, really happy for this afternoon. Over to you, Elisa.
Thank you so much. So let's just wrap this thing up and thank ourselves for taking the time for important discussions and for the great presentations. And let's continue the work. I really like the John's idea. Well, let's do it anyway. If the institution doesn't work that way, what we all know in our hearts, that is what we need. So let's do it ourselves. Thank you and have a very nice afternoon still. Goodbye.